but unfortunately we got a half-baked product that was worse than Destiny 1 in many ways. In fact, some players were so disappointed that they wanted to just go back to Destiny 1 and abandon D2 altogether. This disappointment surrounding the launch was catastrophic for player retention, much like it was during the original launch of 2014. This was only amplified because many players were giving Destiny a second chance, but then they felt like they got burned by Bungie for a second time. In addition to the returning players though, there were also millions of new players who were trying out the game, and especially with Destiny 2 coming to PC, this was our big chance to go mainstream and become one of the biggest games on the market. For a few days, we actually did succeed, with the game actively surpassing 1 million concurrent players. All of the big streamers were covering the game, it was everywhere on the news, and this was a huge moment for the community. Soon enough though, the hype died down, and we all noticed the flaws like the token system, the microtransactions, the slow gameplay, and the complete lack of endgame content. The player count plummeted to dangerously low levels, and especially with the release of the terrible Curse of Osiris expansion, it looks like Destiny might not even survive for the next year. Fortunately for us, Bungie absolutely cooked the following year, and they delivered Forsaken, one of the greatest expansions the game has ever seen. They finally removed the awful weapon system where players could only use 2 extremely weak primaries, and they brought back special weapons that made the gameplay feel much faster and more interesting. The amazing random roll perks returned, the new raid was great, there were new subclass trees, the story was compelling, the very first dungeon was introduced, Gambit was really popular at first, and both of the new locations were very impressive. Player morale was at a high for the first time since Taken King, but believe it or not, this was the time where things really started to take a turn for the worse. A few months after the expansion, Bungie parted ways with Activision, who had been publishing the game and working with them since Destiny 1. At the time, players rejoiced, and everyone thought this would allow Bungie to make the game reach that huge potential that we always knew it had. Unfortunately though, the split with Activision also meant that Bungie lost the support of 2 major studios who were helping them make the game, and thus, the next year did not contain a lot of content. Seasons became less involved, they no longer contained raids, and even the following expansions were significantly smaller than expected. This was evident in Shadowkeep, where the story left players with more questions than answers. It delivered no new destinations other than a reskinned moon from Destiny 1, and there was also a mediocre raid, nothing for Gambit, and essentially nothing for PvP. The game notably became free-to-play, which absolutely spiked the player counts to insane levels, but this also caused Bungie to drastically change their approach to game design. Instead of focusing on improving the core of the game like they did in the past, Bungie leadership was now focused exclusively on developing paid content. This meant that all free content, including PvP, would essentially get 0 development. They basically gave 0 attention to strikes, Gambit, and anything else that wasn't a part of a season or an expansion. Even Trials of Osiris, Destiny's most iconic PvP mode, returned in a terrible state, with 0 new loot and just some old reskins from Destiny 1. This decision to abandon the development of Destiny's core would prove itself to be one of the more damaging decisions for the game's future. Expansion after expansion, there would be literally 0 PvP content, and this understandably led to most PvP players quitting the game. Nowadays, almost nobody plays the game for its PvP anymore, but back in the day, it was a much different story. PvP used to actually be respected and updated, and it was a huge part of the game for many players such as myself. Expansions used to bring us 8 PvP maps and a handful of new modes, but sadly, Bungie decided to alienate millions of players by completely abandoning PvP and reassigning their developers to instead work on Marathon. Another thing that irreparably damaged the game and its reputation was Bungie's refusal to deal with cheaters, even when they were completely overrunning the game. When Trials returned, you literally couldn't play a single card on PC without facing multiple teams of hackers who absolutely ruined the experience for everyone else. The Crucible became a total joke, and yet again, PvP players felt extremely disrespected and disappointed. The game had essentially 0 anti-cheat, and for years, Bungie leadership simply refused to invest money in the security of their game. By the time they would finally partner with an anti-cheat company in 2021, many Crucible players had already quit the game out of frustration. Due to the split with Activision, Shadowkeep and the following seasons had very little content, and players were unhappy that Shadowkeep was so much smaller than Forsaken. Bungie leadership noticed this, and they concluded that they had actually over-delivered by releasing too much content in Forsaken. They thought that it was a mistake to create an amazing expansion like Forsaken because players now expected that future expansions would also be amazing and also have a large amount of content. So from this point onward, Bungie leadership decided that they would produce consistently mediocre content so that the player base would always know what to expect. Instead of letting their developers create something awesome, the leadership forced them to release a worse product. There were allegedly many situations where a team of developers wanted to go above and beyond and create something really cool, but then the leadership stepped in and told them, and I quote, "We should not ship this because it's an over-delivery that will set us up for failure in the future." Looking back, many players consider this the reason why Destiny has stagnated over the years. There was a lack of content, a severe lack of innovation, and no ambition for making anything that might actually shake things up and surprise us. Every single season felt identical because Bungie wanted to avoid over-delivery, but in the end, the repetitive and boring seasonal model would turn out to be extremely detrimental to the game. Many people even started misinterpreting this and calling Bungie lazy, but in reality, the hardworking and passionate developers were just being held back by their management. Following Destiny's move to become free-to-play, the presence of microtransactions and in-game monetization started to increase substantially. This had already become a contentious topic in the community, but players were becoming increasingly annoyed as Bungie added more and more items to their ever-expanding Eververse store. During the rest of the year of Shadowkeep, this happened, and therefore everyone went into lockdown and started playing a lot of video games. Bungie saw this as an opportunity to expand, an opportunity to grow beyond Destiny, and ultimately become a studio with multiple successful games. They went on an absolute spending spree, hiring hundreds of new employees and handing out hundreds of promotions to existing employees. In fact, they gave out so many promotions that there were now too many managers with big salaries and not enough people to do the actual work. That is a direct quote from people who worked there, by the way. Like, they literally had too many higher-ups and not enough real developers who would actually make the game. In addition to this, Bungie leadership started to mismanage their resources to an extreme degree. Instead of focusing their capital and efforts on Destiny 3, they instead spent millions of dollars developing new games that would ultimately never see the light of day. They took hundreds of talented developers away from working on Destiny and instead put them on all of these little incubation games. Many different projects were created, developed, expanded, and then destroyed, costing the studio an unfathomable amount of money. As one person described it, Bungie somehow seems to forget that they only have one product, yet they seem to put their focus towards everything except for that one thing making them money. Their senior leadership needs to be gutted. They simply don't have the first idea on how to run a gaming company, it seems. It wasn't just random people on the internet who thought this either, because internally there were reports of employees straight up telling the upper management that doing all of these incubation projects was not going to work out very well. When the Beyond Light expansion finally released in 2020, Bungie leadership made perhaps their greatest mistake of all time by removing huge chunks of content from the game. They actually took away a lot more content than they added, so this expansion was in fact not an expansion, it was actually a contraction. The removal of content and the so-called Destiny Content Vault was easily the most hated thing they've ever done, and all of this content simply got deleted. Like, just look at the amount of stuff they removed. Bungie claimed that removing the content was necessary, and maybe it was, but it had an extreme ripple effect that crippled the game for years to come. It also had a massively negative impact on player sentiment, with one popular comment reading, "They lost my trust and I stopped playing when they removed the campaign we paid for." That's theft, literally. There were hundreds of videos and articles just absolutely roasting the game for deleting its own content, and you've got to understand, it is not normal for an MMO to do this. Destiny quickly got the reputation for being that game that deletes its own content, and this was a massive meme in the broader gaming community. They can legally remove whatever they want from the game, but from the gamer's perspective, it simply sucks to buy things and then have them taken away a couple years later. Existing players of the game were obviously unhappy about the removal of content, but the people who got hurt the most were actually the new players. Since such a large portion of the game's history just got deleted, it became extremely difficult for new players to get started and understand what is going on in the game. With almost all of the story no longer existing, Destiny's narrative became extremely confusing because you could no longer experience all of the events in the timeline. The vast majority of free-to-play content was also gutted, so new players became far less likely to actually get deep into the game and want to buy the expansions. The new player experience as a whole was just an unmitigated catastrophe, and somehow Bungie leadership decided that they were okay with this. Year after year, nothing would be done to improve the new player experience. New players are essential to keeping any live service game alive, and it blows my mind that Bungie leadership did not invest a single dollar into fixing this absolute disaster. There have been thousands of Reddit posts where a new player joins the game, gets completely lost, and then quits because the game is so unbelievably confusing and literally nothing is explained. I have 2 different million-view videos explaining exactly what is wrong with the new player experience. I basically spoon-fed the exact list of issues to Bungie, but still, their leadership decided to do nothing. They would eventually add a couple small tweaks like the Guardian rank system, but quite truthfully, these things did not move the needle for improving the new player experience. In other news, the Beyond Light expansion continued the trend of neglecting PvP by removing 11 maps instead of adding any new ones. Especially considering the introduction of the overpowered Stasis subclass, PvP got infinitely worse as a result of this expansion. This was especially obvious if you ever watched the best players in the world, because the only 2 times that they would lose a game is if they lost to a cheater or if they lost to Stasis. Bungie was also famous for being extremely slow at fixing any of the issues with their game, and this time was no exception. It took an entire year for the broken Stasis abilities to finally get balanced. Frustrating would be an understatement. Later in the year, Bungie finally introduced a much-desired transmog system that allowed you to customize your appearance. This would have been cause for much more celebration, but unfortunately,
So you can.
Yeah, I kind of need that. Yeah, there.
Oh my god, don't hit me.
1 HP, I'm fucking 1 HP.
Oh, I took my own thing out. I wasn't thinking.
The sentries do a fuck ton of damage to you guys. Can you fucking kill them? Yeah, there you go. You just went for the fucking mine. It's okay if we fail the mission. We're only grinding super credits. Remember?
Who is he talking? Is he on the phone with someone? What is?
No, don't destroy that. Fuck. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to run up to these guys and start smacking them. The fucking baton. I want to do so bad. Oh, talk with the guy using it. I was like, how the fuck do you get this? And I was this mission is like. I'm asking for your opinion. Do you just want to like leave, or you want to keep trying to deal with this? In my opinion, I would just leave. But I'm kind of dying for super credits. Okay, just leave. Okay, it's up to me. Mission to a squad. I'm sorry.
Leave, man. Leave. Oh, okay.
Super credits by yourself helps, but you know, having someone to help you grind too is beneficial.
Is he talking to me? I'm so confused because I.
By just talking to yourself every single. But how many fucking super? Oh my god! Literally, like half the community is online right now. Holy fuck!
One mission more.
Yeah, this one for cheap intel. I think that'll give us a big enough city to complete.
Engaging orbital thrusters.
I'm literally like.
I'm gonna go with my usual. Well, no,
Yeah, that's a big enough city. I'll do. I think we'll go like right here.
I'm gonna change my orbitals. I'm gonna go with my usual.
Nade launcher, cause I want.
I'm gonna go with the precision.
I want that.
And something else that's unlimited that resets quickly. Let's try this one. Fuck it. Then we're gonna go running. There we go. Let's try this one out.
These things are so good. Fire missile.
My mic's not on. How is he? It just keeps going.
Hellpod launch initiated.
HV exosuits.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Yeah, my mic's not on.
Like a flamethrower version of the fucking mech. They're walking around the light version, heavy version. Oh, if they had light versions and heavy versions, that would be fucking busted. Imagine just some like the size of a dreadnought, like the
History will remember your deeds this day.
I'm stuttering. Fuck. You know the Devastators? Yeah. But like it would look like that, but like not look like that. It would look like an old exosuit. Exosuit.
Yes, I have people in the room with them. This is crazy.
Bulkier. That's what I'm like.
He does not stop talking since I joined this.
Like, they make a light version and medium version and heavy version. Make it simple at least. Oh,
Damn.
whatever that is. I think that's a scout, yeah. Yeah, it's literally just a scout. Master glitches weapons. Okay, where's an area that we can infiltrate? Over here, over here. Again, instantaneously, a big one. Oh shit.
Helldivers, reporting to the front. Orbital inbound.
That sounds so satisfying.
Now you see that going off. Why would you walk?
Overseer. Kill your fucking self. Overseer is fucking annoying. They're silent as hell, bro. You fucking hear them coming. Where the fuck are they? And they're fucking behind me. Got you, got you. There you go. What is he shooting at? Literally shooting at dead bodies.
God, this. Alright, it's time for me to go. This kid keeps killing me. He keeps killing me. I finally get back and. Sorry. It took me so long to get going. I need a break already.
Hey all, this is Redditosker. I want to talk about the Game Awards. More specifically, I want to give my thoughts on Night Rain. I got really excited last night when I was watching over stream, as anyone that was in that stream can attest to. Before I talk about how the game's actually going to be like, I want to talk about the trailer. Because it was a hell of a combo attack. You prime me with the initial scene, displaying the world of Elden Ring. Then you show the character's speed and the added movement options. You have characters talking in the background, including Margit, indicating that there's lore. And then you drop Nameless King. I didn't notice the Centipede Demon before, so the first time I noticed that bosses from Souls games were here was when Nameless King was on the scene. Of course, from interviews posted after the trailer, we know that Elden Ring Night Rain will happen in its own continuity. The director, who is not Miyazaki this time, said the following. We'd like fans to think of Night Rain as an Elden Ring spin-off first and foremost. The story is completely separate and parallel to the world of Elden Rings. If you had to tie it in some way, we had the events of the Shattering in the original game. After the events of the Shattering, there is a completely separate branch of the Elden Ring story. So basically, the Shattering happens canonically in Night Rain's story. And then from that point, there's a divergence. This is an alternate timeline kind of story. But probably the best way to look at it is like it's Hyrule Warriors. In Hyrule Warriors, different heroes and villains from Zelda games get dragged into a conflict that really have any implications for Dark Souls' lore, or the Nameless King himself. It was also confirmed that George R. R. Martin had no influence on Night Rain's story or world. And I don't think Miyazaki is involved either. This isn't confirmed anywhere, but I think it's certain. In previous interviews, Miyazaki has talked about how he wants the directors of From Software going forward to have full creative control of their projects, and that they don't need to be bound by his directing style. He's also said that he doesn't like to look at the projects other people are working on because he would want to change things, and that could negatively impact the project since his is not the vision that's trying to be created. He's mentioned several times that games should only have one director, and he has expressed regret at his handling of Dark Souls 2 as a supervisor, feeling that he meddled too much, and that going forward he would step away from the supervisory role and give the directors full creative control so that they could flourish in their new projects. So given that both Martin and Miyazaki are uninvolved, there's probably very little we can do with the lore of Night Rain that we can extrapolate back to Elden Ring. Probably. But there are a couple of situations that I can think of where that wouldn't be the case. So anything that has to do with Souls bosses coming into Elden Ring, yeah, you can probably dismiss all that. However, what if Godwyn appears and we have him as a boss fight? Then can we extrapolate from that the nature of his undeath? Or maybe something simpler. Let's say Radahn speaks. He's also a boss and he talks. Even if it's just a few words. And from his words, we can ascertain his nature. Do we then extrapolate that this is the same nature that Radahn had in the base game of Elden Ring? If Miquella appears for some reason, and from his behavior we can ascertain his values, can we then say that those are the same values held by Miquella in Elden Ring? Maybe. I think in those cases, should they come to pass, it's going to have to be, well, I'll have to look at it. I'll have to look at it. The difference between this and something like Hyrule Warriors is that the world of Hyrule Warriors is new, and it was made by the creators. But we've confirmed that this happens not in a new world, but in the same world with an alternate timeline. Like this Night Lord that's talked about in the trailers. What if he's the Lord of Night that's talked about by the Eternal City dwellers? the Lord of Night that they're waiting for. That would be interesting. And in cases like these, their lore significance for Elden Ring I would not dismiss so readily. I'm prepared to dismiss it, but it's a we'll see kind of situation. Now let's talk about the game itself. What is it? Its description is standalone co-op action survival game. I should probably dispel some misunderstandings that people are having for it here. It's not a live service game. You can play the game solo, which means it probably won't always be online. There's no evidence or indication that there's going to be a premium currency or a battle pass, and I don't believe that those are going to be things. I don't think there's going to be microtransactions. People dooming about this topic, I think, are just used to being abused by other companies and are fearful that From Software is going in that direction. None of those things are true. It also probably won't be full price. According to PC Gamer, they were told that the price would be comparable to Shadow the Erdtree, but the price wasn't confirmed, so it will probably be between $30 to $40. The gameplay is 3-player co-op. Both you and the enemies engage in combat in the same way. The differences will be that you are playing as predefined characters, and each one of those characters will have special moves that only they can do, kinda like individualized Ashes of War. The goal apparently is to survive 3 days. At the end of each day there will be a boss for you to overcome, and on the final day you'll fight the final boss of the area. Before the time runs out and you have to fight the nighttime boss or the final boss of the area, you go around to the environment and collect loot. I don't think that enemies will drop armor. I don't think you can equip armor onto your character because you're preset characters and they have a distinct appearance. And apparently skins are something that you'll be able to earn later. However, enemies will drop different weapons, and apparently also different passive perks that you will use to strengthen your character, with the goal of every run optimizing your build as best you can on the fly. This optimization seems to be part of the appeal so that you're able to be strong enough to deal with the nighttime bosses at the end. It has a battle royale-like system where it has the circle that's enclosing in on you, which serves as your time limit and restricts the places that you can get to if you don't move quickly enough. Now, interestingly, there is a progression. When I heard about this game, I thought there would be just, you go in, you make your build, you kill the boss, and that's it. But no, apparently there's progression in the form of character stories, and you'll get permanent loot from runs. There'll be a roundtable hold-like area, and in this place you'll be able to talk to all the characters except for the one that you're playing. There'll be a training ground in that area where you can practice using their skills. There is a story, and there's apparently narrative progression for each individual characters, and how that exactly is going to work is not clear yet, but it's good enough that it exists. I think that's good enough for now. I'll have more to say when I see more. There's going to be a network test on February, which is not far away, and that will let us really understand the game fully. There's also implications on this network test that the game might not be too far off, like this might not be end of the year kind of game. The time span between Elden Ring's network tests and the full release was pretty short after all. It was 4 months, and it was actually planned to be 3 months. So if development has gone well, I wouldn't be surprised if we get it in 3 months or less past the network test. Now there's one specific reason why I'm excited for this game, and it's because co-op in Elden Ring sucks, and it has always sucked. This is something I talk about all the time. The bosses in Elden Ring and Dark Souls are not suited for multiple targets. They can't effectively deal with 2 people. And that's because Elden Ring is not built from the ground up to be co-op. It is a single-player game with co-op functionality attached to the side. This becomes really clear if you play a game like Remnant 2, which is a Souls-like that has co-op functionality built into it. Those bosses are very capable of dealing with multiple targets. They're designed for it. And that seems to be what Night Rain is going for. It's Elden Ring, but finally balanced for co-op. You can see this most clearly by looking at the Cerberus boss in the desert. He has white sweeping chain attacks, able to target all 3 players at once, and at a certain phase in the fight, it turns into 3 separate wolves, each targeting a different player. I suspect that all of the bosses introduced here, whether they're new, whether they're from Elden Ring, or whether they're from Dark Souls, they will be reworked to be able to do things like this. And that's what has me most excited. Imagine what they will do to the Nameless King to be able to deal with characters from Elden Ring, and not just one of them, 3 of them. I think he's going to be transformed into an absolutely incredible fight. And I expect the same from any other famous bosses that we get from the Souls games. I'm hoping Artorias makes a return, and maybe not with his arm broken. Even the ones from Elden Ring aren't going to work the same. They're going to be reworked too. Margit, if we do get Radon, it's going to be incredible. Finally, as a last topic, I think I'll address the people that are unhappy with Night Rain. I've seen a number of people either upset about them reusing assets, the very premise of having bosses from Dark Souls appear in Elden Ring, the introduction of Battle Royale-like mechanics like the circle that, encloses in the space and serves as a time limit. So I'd like to give my opinion on that. First, let me read a quote from the director. "We've always been seen as a company that makes these Souls-likes or this kind of traditional formula of Souls-like games. And so I saw this as an opportunity to do something different, to challenge both myself and the company to build something new, while still using what we've cultivated with our previous titles. Also, personally, I enjoy these co-op multiplayer experiences, and I wanted to make something that was very much focused on that with Night Rain." Okay, so here's my perspective. From Software has literally never failed me. Ever since I became a fan with Demon's Souls, I don't believe they've made a bad game, and even going back before Miyazaki, I've played a lot of their older From Software titles, and they too are really good. Based exclusively on their track record, I have no reason to suspect that Night Rain will be bad. As for the asset reuse, I don't believe that this is almost ever a valid criticism. Every company, and From Software more than anybody, reuses their assets all the time. And if they're not reused, they're repurposed. Not only that, in this circumstance, I want them to reuse the assets because the asset is the Nameless King model. I want to fight an updated Nameless King. I think people are misunderstanding this game. This is like Hyrule Warriors. It makes sense to reuse the assets not just to save time, but to be able to interact with beloved old bosses. Think of the game more like the Subspace Emissary thing from Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and a lot of this will make more sense. I'm also really happy that From Software is tackling something new. They're venturing into genres that they haven't done before, and they're gaining experience doing it. This is not a game directed by Miyazaki. Miyazaki is hard at work at his own project, and there are other projects at work in From Software at the same time. Even better, I'm hoping that the experience that they gain from doing this kind of work translates to make their other games better, as it usually does. An example being Armored Core benefiting from the experience they had gained making Souls games. Their experience balancing co-op here could finally translate into the main Souls games going forward, improving the co-op and maybe integrating it into the game more seamlessly. I also just don't think that Battle Royales are a bad genre. Like, I don't play them, but in principle I don't turn my nose up at them. This isn't a Battle Royale, it has some Battle Royale-like mechanics, but I wouldn't scoff at it even if it was a Battle Royale. It's kind of funny, I often see criticism of From Software because they make games in their Souls formula so often, but now they take a baby step into new genres and the opposite criticism comes along. In my opinion, people dooming about this are being silly. It was well known, and I covered it, that From Software was going to have a lot of new directors making a lot of different games going forward. I expect yearly releases from Software. That doesn't mean they're not also working on their larger, more important projects. The way I see it, it's like this. You can have the big project from Software every 3 years, let's say, and then get nothing else from them in that time span. Or you can get that same big project from them every 3 years, and also get smaller side projects the other 2 years. That's the situation that I think we find ourselves in. We're getting a lot, and it's all going to be good. Even if this game is a smaller $40 project, I expect it'll still be very good. So personally, I don't see this as an indication of From Software's downfall. That's the end of this video. As always, thank you very much for watching.
Hi everyone, my console-like experience. Valve would create the operating system called SteamOS, and partners like Gigabyte, Main Gear, and Alienware would create hardware to run SteamOS, which would be dubbed as Steam Machines. These Steam Machines, along with the controller and the Steam Link streaming box, were all launched in November of 2015, generating very underwhelming sales. And while this project was very short-lived and somewhat of a failure, Valve was able to take a lot of the ideas and technologies and use them years later down the line for the Steam Deck that was released in 2022 and has been much more successful. While these old Steam machines weren't ever very practical, I can remember seeing them back in the day and thinking they were super cool, and that even if I couldn't justify buying one at the time, I would still love to own one in the future. Well, fast forward to a few weeks ago, I found one of the Alienware Alpha Steam machines on eBay for only $40 plus shipping, so I decided to say what the heck and purchased it along with an original Steam controller and a Steam Link to see what these old console replacement PC products were all about. But there was one slight problem. Fully working ones were still going for hundreds of dollars, and to get one this cheap, I had to buy one that was listed for parts and that would probably take a little bit of work to get back up and running. Opening up the Steam Machines box, I found it packed decently well in some brown paper and paper towels. The only thing included were the system itself and the power adapter. My first impression was this was a pretty darn small system at around 200 by 200 millimeters or about 8 by 8 inches. On first glance, it was definitely a little dirty, but overall looked to be in good shape. The one thing I noticed on the underside was a pretty big buildup of dust in the cracks, and while I wasn't ready to open this guy up just yet, that definitely had me worried about how the inside would look. So I hooked up power, HDMI, and some peripherals. Turning the machine on resulted in no video output, and the power light blinking yellow in a series of 5 blinks at a time. This is a pretty common and well-known issue that from my understanding was a sign of a dead or dying CMOS battery, and because it wasn't booting, it meant it was in fact time to open it up. Removing 4 screws at the bottom allowed me to pull off the bottom panel, and the top panel could then just be lifted away to reveal a pretty dusty interior. I pulled out the CPU and GPU fans to try and find the CMOS battery, but couldn't find it. After doing some research online, I learned the CMOS battery is very conveniently placed on the bottom of the motherboard, requiring a basically full teardown. So I unscrewed and removed the hard drive, then took out the 4 motherboard screws, unscrewed and removed the back I/O panel, and then lifted up the motherboard tray, revealing the CMOS battery. It was secured with double-sided tape and connected to the motherboard with a 2-pin connector. To test if the battery was actually bad, I grabbed my multimeter to measure the battery's voltage. Probing the 2 pins, I found the battery was reading at under 2 volts, which for comparison, a new battery of the same type gives about 3.3 volts. This meant the battery was definitely going to need to be replaced. Now I could have bought a $5 replacement off Amazon that included a new connector and everything, but I have a bunch of these 2032 button cell batteries on hand, so I decided to try and modify the existing connector to fit a new battery. I cut open the plastic covering and tore off the 2 contact points on the old battery, then I electrical taped both contacts to a new one and wrapped it up in more electrical tape. Testing those contact points again now showed the battery cell was giving off the appropriate 3.3 volts, so then I plugged in and taped down the new battery. I plugged the PC back in, thought I was in the clear, then it started blinking yellow again, which I realized that to reset everything I need to unplug the battery, hold in the power button for 60 seconds, let the PC sit for 20 minutes, and then I could plug the battery back in, plug the system back into power, and this time when I booted it up, the light thankfully stayed blue, meaning the CMOS problem had been corrected. And after switching out the HDMI cable, I finally had display out. I booted to the Windows image that was installed, which I assume was the previous owner's, and this is a good reminder to anyone watching this to make sure to wipe or remove any drives from a system you're selling, even if you think the system is dead. Now I'm gonna clean up and upgrade the system so we can see its full potential, but I figured let's install a fresh copy of Windows first on it and see how it performs in its current configuration. Speaking of the current configuration, it's time to talk about the PC itself and its specs. Now being 100% truthful, this is the Alienware Steam machine, but it also isn't. See, because the Steam Machine concept was so unsuccessful, companies like Alienware took their Steam Machine hardware and sold versions with Windows pre-installed instead, which is what I have here. The only difference is this came originally with Windows 8 instead of SteamOS. It would have originally come with an Xbox controller instead of a Steam one, and this bottom illuminated piece right here would have had a Steam logo. But other than those minor things, this is the exact same hardware, including CPU, GPU, case, and all that was used for the Alienware Steam Machine. In terms of specs, this is the base model that retailed for $450 and came with an Intel Core i3 4130T, so a 4th gen Intel CPU with 2 cores, 4 threads, and a frequency of 2.9 GHz. The CPU released all the way back in 2013 and is socketed into the board, so it is upgradable. The GPU used is, from my understanding, basically an NVIDIA GTX 860M, which was a mid-range laptop GPU released in 2014. It is 2GB of video memory and is found in all levels of the version 1 Alienware Steam Machine and Alpha. For RAM, this originally came with a single 4GB stick of DDR3 memory, but at some point the previous owner also added an extra 8GB stick for 12 total, which is another reminder this is pretty old hardware, as it's kind of crazy to think of a gaming system shipping with 4GB of RAM. For storage, this used a 500GB thin 2.5-inch hard drive, and it's all wrapped up in this console-like enclosure. For I/O, it has the power input, dual HDMI, SPDIF audio, Gigabit Ethernet, and 4 USB ports, 2 USB 3 at the back, and 2 USB 2 at the front. Also, while I am going to wait to upgrade most of the parts, I did switch out the hard drive for a 1TB SATA SSD from the get-go just to make initial testing a bit faster. So I did a fresh install of Windows 10, which I'll be using for my main tests, but we will try and install SteamOS 3 on this later in the video. I honestly had no idea if this machine would be able to run pretty much anything modern, especially with only 12GB of RAM, a dual-core i3, and 2GB of video memory, but I fired up a few games to get some initial data. I started with Rainbow Six using the built-in benchmark. I tested this machine at 1080p with the low preset. Doing this resulted in a honestly pretty solid 63 FPS average with 1% lows of 44. This was good to see it above 60 FPS, but again, this is just Rainbow Six and isn't very hard to run. Next, I upped the difficulty by running Borderlands 3 at 1080p very low settings using the built-in benchmark. This resulted in a 36 FPS average with 1% lows of 25. This is definitely on the edge of playable, so I hopped into a game to see what kind of experience it would give me, and yes, it was a bit stuttery, but overall this gave a surprisingly playable experience, which definitely had me excited to see how it would perform after some upgrades. Finally, for the heck of it, I decided to test Cyberpunk 2077, but I knew this would struggle, so I set it to 720p low and fired up the built-in benchmark. Doing this resulted in a 31 FPS average with 1% lows of 19, which honestly was surprising. It gave above 30 FPS. In game, it definitely wasn't what I would consider playable, but it also didn't crash or anything, so again, maybe after a CPU upgrade, Cyberpunk will be playable. Also, temps weren't that bad, with the CPU and GPU both never going above the mid-70s, and the machine was a little noisy, but I don't think I would consider it obnoxious. So now it's time to clean the machine up and throw in a couple upgrades. I started by fully tearing the system down, removing everything except for the CPU so that I could clean each part individually. Now I wasn't super thorough, I just used some 99% isopropyl alcohol along with a toothbrush and some paper towel to quickly clean everything up. The one part I used a different method on was the fans, which I just used a toothbrush and vacuum on. This got most of the dust out, and while they're not perfect, they definitely look and should perform a bit better. With everything cleaned up a bit, it was time to throw in the upgrades and put the Steam Machine back together. The first upgrade was already made, which was changing the mechanical drive for a 1TB SATA SSD. The second upgrade was to take out the old i3 4130T and replace it with an i7 4765T, which is a 4-core 8-thread CPU that can turbo up to 3 GHz. And if you're wondering, this machine requires a 35-watt TDP CPU, so something like a 4790K is out of the question. This upgraded i7 should provide nearly twice as much multi-threaded performance, but on a single core basis it should be basically the same. After installing that, putting some thermal paste on and resecuring the cooler, I next applied and spread out thermal paste on the GPU die and reinstalled its cooler. Once that was done, I could move on to the final upgrade, which was installing a 16GB kit of dual-channel DDR3 memory. This is a kit I had on hand from Team Group that should work nicely in this build. With the upgrades in, I could then just fully reassemble the system and load back into Windows to see what kind of performance I would get. Firstly, going back into Rainbow Six at 1080p low, I did see a minor increase to 66 FPS average and 48 for the 1% lows, which was an increase from the original 63 and 44 I got earlier, but was less of an increase than I expected. Borderlands 3 was a similar story, with the average going from 36 to 37 and 1% lows going from 25 to 29, so again, pretty marginal improvements. Cyberpunk was even more the same, with both the average and 1% lows increasing by only 1 each, so going from 31 to 32 for the average and 19 to 20 for the 1% lows. I honestly expected a little more performance out of these upgrades, but looking at most of the benchmarks, even before the CPU and RAM upgrades, showed the GPU was in a lot of cases the limiting factor. With that being said, even though this machine really isn't great for modern gaming, just going around Windows and doing basic productivity was perfectly fine. Now, originally paired with the Steam machine would have been the Steam controller, which I had to buy separate on eBay. It runs on AA batteries that have a pretty neat eject function, and this has a dongle that plugs into a dedicated USB port on the bottom of the Steam machine. This controller features all the normal controller buttons you'd expect, but instead of a right joystick and D-pad, the Steam controller has dual trackpads, making navigating the OS and playing PC games theoretically easier. In addition to these, there's also 2 buttons on the back sides of the hand grips. Along with this controller, Valve released the Steam Input Configurator, which allowed you to customize the buttons and inputs on the controller to fit your exact playstyle and liking. This is a pretty neat and well thought out controller, and while I think it is very good for navigating around Windows, in-game I kinda just found it a little awkward and honestly much prefer just a standard Xbox controller. With that being said, I am happy I was able to get my hands on one and play around with it, as I've always been curious about what they were like to use. After the upgrades and testing out the controller, I decided to see if I could install SteamOS 3 on the system, which is what comes on the Steam Deck. I tried to install it via Nabara, but just couldn't get it to work. See, even though Nvidia support was recently added to SteamOS, as far as I can tell, it's only really for more modern Nvidia GPUs, and this weird 860M just wasn't supported, which was disappointing. Now there's one more product to talk about which released at the same time as the Steam machines did, which is the Steam Link streaming box. This $50 box allowed you to stream your PC games directly to your TV, and it works pretty darn good even in 2024, but it does only support 1080p, so if you already had a PC, it made no sense to get a Steam machine when for $400 less you could just get this Steam Link box and in many cases have a better gaming experience. So all in all, for modern gaming, the Alienware Steam machine just doesn't really seem to be worth it. Now for general Windows use, it's absolutely fine and could even probably be used as a retro games console. With that being said, this all got me wondering what a modern Steam machine would look like, and now I kinda wanna build one with a custom case, so if you'd like to see me try and build a modern interpretation of a Steam machine and install SteamOS 3 on it, let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know what you think of this little Steam machine and if you think Valve should bring them back. So yeah guys, I think this wraps this video up. I may make a follow-up video about the Steam machine if there's enough interest, but for now, I think I'm done playing around with it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And as always, this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.
With the advent of the PlayStation and other 5th-gen devices, 3D gaming became not just possible, but the driving force in the medium to this day. But those who stuck with 2D sprite-based games a little longer were able to exploit that more powerful hardware to deliver some of the most impressive 2D games we ever got. Whether it was for impressive arcade ports or original titles though, the focus of a lot of these more advanced sprite-based games was to push beyond what would have been possible on SNES or Mega Drive with 2D titles that went for faster, more explosive gameplay. And then there was Rayman. Released in '95 for almost every 5th-gen console, it was a game that tapped into the power of those new systems for a 2D adventure with a much more laid-back mood. Its detailed sprite work used to draw a world of whimsy, played at a more deliberate, slower pace, a tone that clashes with its brutally hard gameplay. But that makes it stand out a bit for its time. Rayman spends the first half of the game being unable to run. He plods through environments sometimes devoid of music, going purely for an ambient feel, which is odd coming off a generation of 2D console games that would usually be blasting beats at you relentlessly. It's an atmospheric world, but far from grounded. Giant musical instruments and pencil lands crop up, but perhaps that's what offers Rayman its unique vibe. It depicts these nonsensical worlds, but presents them in considered detail, and instead of blasting clown music or something at you while you go through them, it garnishes them with reverence through tasteful ambient tracks. Though there is of course clown music sometimes, it ain't that avant-garde. Rayman is set in a world of limbless creatures, and one sinister character, Mr. Dark, tries to take over by stealing a magical orb called the Protoon, throwing off the world's balance when these little ball guys who float around it called the Electoons scatter across the land. Rayman is a guy who is tasked by a fairy to take him on and reunite the Protoon and Electoons, beat a boss made evil by this corrupted land, and do a dance with them. Maybe you can already see a potential problem. Mario! Mario has a pretty nonsensical world, but the instigating incident is pretty approachable. A princess has been kidnapped by a dragon. Pretty clear stakes. A kingdom is missing its monarch. Who's gonna be on the money? Toad Washington? Maybe. Rayman has one of these mumbo-jumbo fantasy plots that makes its esoteric world just that bit harder to grapple with than it already was. Something that would come to hurt Rayman as a brand. But none of that makes the gameplay itself any less fun. No, the continue system does that, but I get ahead of myself. Rayman's core moveset doesn't do anything out of the ordinary. He jumps, he hovers. His most interesting move is simply his punch, which he can charge to go longer distances while stationary and can grapple him onto hooks in a good double use for the mechanic. The game is more about how each wacky environment can augment the play. Slippy slopes create momentum, trumpets blow Rayman off quickly in different directions. There's objects that need to be broken through, and others like giant plums can be pushed around and ridden on to access new places. I mean, we are collecting stress ball-sized electrons amongst giant pencils. Is this a miniature world? One of many stray thoughts that will cross your mind while playing. I guess that's kind of the point. Rayman is precision platforming at its most precise. Pixel perfection becomes a requisite as the game goes on. You're blessed with a character with lots of air control, and your reward for that is very demanding platforming. There's a reason Rayman walks by default and can only do so for half the game. A single footstep here is the difference between life and death. Relative to the size of the screen, Rayman is also quite a big dude, showing off his intricate animations. So the game is kind of like one very unhinged game of Operation, where you're trying to tweeze him out of wherever he is. Also, there's this guy. For the most part, I enjoy the challenge in Rayman. Gauging the right distance you need to be at for a ledge grab can sometimes be a bit frustrating, and some surprises do seem intentionally cruel and unpredictable on a first run, but most of the time the little endurance tests the game proposes can be quite satisfying to overcome. Dense levels that combine precision jumping with protecting Rayman by batting things out of the way often make for quite dynamic and exciting sections. The bosses certainly fall into that category of play, with satisfying wallops rewarding your continued survival. However, even me, as the target demographic for this kind of intensity, finds the life and continue system to be far too unforgiving. I'm sure that's not a unique perspective. 5 continues for the whole game, a warning that should have been printed on the box, alongside super long stretches of play, with no way to save your progress until the end. Honestly, this could be the greatest scam in history, a game with one of the most Humpty Dumpty aesthetics of all time, luring in kids to make a killing on pocket money spent on password and cheat code books. Then at the end, the game goes double ruthless, forcing you to basically get 100% completion for any ending at all. One that ends up being almost mocking in its brazen abruptness.
You've done it. You've saved the world!
The extra level of difficulty the life system delivers, I really do think is made worse by the game's aesthetic and tone being so extremely child-friendly. So CBeebies coded, and its everything has a face, art design, and its levels atmosphere being so relaxed. Sometimes a game can reinforce resilience against a hard difficulty by inspiring hardness in the player, reflecting the challenge with a gritty world and premise to match. Rayman does the exact opposite, and losing 20 minutes of progress to the sound of clown horns easily inspires contempt. Take Rayman himself, for example. No matter what horrors are chasing him, he still just kind of smiles placidly. Made even funnier in the first half when he's forced to just walk calmly away from any situation. Yes, it can be quite funny to headcanon this as some kind of next-level stoic stride for the ages, but in practice, Rayman comes off as a very schizophrenic character. As he navigates some truly hellish levels, he's just calmly smiling while strolling around, beaming euphorically when he glides around, while I'm out here fighting for my life. So is he just kind of like an airhead and rather oblivious to the danger around him? Well, he's not that either, because when you stand still sometimes, he'll act scared about what's happening. Then you move, and in a couple of frames, he's just back to zen. Crash Bandicoot released a year later, and that game did the oblivious main character very effectively, because between vacant stares, Crash doesn't exactly look zen at all, in the way Rayman often looks when he shouldn't. Don't perfect a level and Crash looks beat at the end, framing the whole affair as the tricky obstacle course it was, while Rayman always carries on like the whole thing was one big concert. At the end of the day, none of this is a huge deal. You can tell the objective here wasn't to create some consistently defined world, or characters, or even any real big new mechanical concepts, but to flex on the player with a large variety of impressive graphics, all rendered with big, intricate sprites running delightfully smooth 60 frames per second animations. The fact that underneath the gameplay itself is at least decent was enough to make this an attractive title in its day, and even now. With every mad idea from the astronaut with the washing machine to Big Bumbo, the angry statue, you can tell there was an eagerness to conceptualize new wacky things at a higher bar of animation not seen often in games, and that it was kind of the last chance to do before 2D fell out of the mainstream. With that happening shortly after its release, there's not a lot that has quite the exact same look or feel as Rayman. So eager to flaunt its disparate ideas, though, it doesn't really become anything iconic in its totality. Seemingly deliberately, it defines itself on its lack of definition, which is weird when the sequel did the exact opposite of that. Rayman 1 is a game that opens with a vaudeville host describing the events of the game like it's one big comedy farce. Rayman 2 is a game where collecting magic energy bugs unlocks the Bible, opening with a grave narration delineating how the population has been enslaved and crippled by tyrants. It's a shocking switch up, to be sure, but not at all a deliberate shock. Rather, based on how little the original game gets referenced at all in 2, just feels like the devs wanted to make a different type of game with a different type of mood and setting. Some concepts carry over when convenient. This is still a platformer about collecting a list of things, so the idea that some scattered little guys that help make up the world's core need to be found is here, but instead of Electoons, they're Lums, and instead of the big pro-tune, they help keep together the heart of the world. A fairy woman still helps Rayman, but she's more, I don't know, street. The world being taken over and enslaved by the robot pirate certainly sets the story up for the possibility of this world being the same as the first games, just under brutal change. But how brutal would that change have had to be? No giant flutes collapsed in the distance, no pencil world falling into decay. While almost everyone in the first game was a limbless magical floating hands being, here everyone except Rayman is limbed up, other than tonic trouble guy reference, which, with no justification from the story, comes off as a deliberate aesthetical choice to cast Rayman as some kind of special being now, retconning his role from average Joe to chosen protector. So is Rayman 2 set in a new world or not? I think it is, and at the same time it isn't. Which is to say, I think they just didn't care. Which is fine for this game as it is, but will have some repercussions down the road. The biggest change though is that this is a 3D game now. With Rayman 1 coming late to the 2D era, Rayman 2 got to release a ways into the 5th gen of consoles all the way in '99. The 6th gen already having started in Japan and the PS2 less than a year away in both Japan and America. This means it got to look a cut above what we were seeing in 3D at the start of the gen, and it got to learn from a lot of those early lessons. It would go on to release on basically every console ever, but we're going to be using the N64 version today. According to Wikipedia, this was the first version of the game ever released, but let's not lean into that logic too much, because it would have meant playing the Atari Jaguar version of Rayman 1, and I did not do that. And look, it even uses the expansion pack for a resolution bump. How nice is that? Rayman keeps more or less the same abilities he had in the first game. With the transition to 3D platforming though comes obligatory changes. With more room for error, platforms become bigger, and there's less need for absolute perfection. Now with these giant 3D pits that stretch out in front of you, Rayman's hoverglide can last indefinitely, allowing him to slowly lower himself into mysterious chasms, all while being able to shoot while doing so. For a 3D game from this era, the camera is pretty great. Not always perfect, they never are, but it feels like it was tinkered with considerably to never get in the player's way no matter the terrain. Plus, adjusting the camera manually is intuitive, and in '99 that's still quite amazing. Something that dramatically decreases since the first game are enemy encounters. With Rayman's shot locking on now, enemies that go down in 1 or 2 hits are no longer much of a threat. So frequent enemy encounters get replaced with the occasional one-on-one enemy duel with healthed up projectile lobbing pirates. They're pretty simplistic fights and not that engaging, but they come infrequently enough to serve as good pace breakers while not being too annoying, plus making it feel like Rayman is doing some damage to the opposing faction. Serious enemy encounters being reduced largely to one-on-ones in this game seems informed by both tech and priorities. Technically, having a lot of pirates on screen at once may have not been feasible, in a game that looks to be pushing its hardware just to display a room as lavishly as it's trying to, and if encounters did throw in more foes, a more robust lock-on system would have had to be implemented, considering how the lock-on that's here likes to get distracted by a harmless crab when this one pirate ambushes Rayman by a beach. And I don't think implementing a better lock-on system was a top mission for the devs who were clearly more interested in creating an atmospheric world, best experienced through a focus on environmental traversal. And that atmosphere is well realized. The game is wrapped up in this beautiful, melancholic mood. The twisting textures from rock to grass suggest an overgrown ancient world. A literal and figurative texture wraps around each level. The music, while a bit stock at times, at others manages to be the perfect complement to the graphics. Whimsical, yet with a touch of uncertainty about what the future may be for this ravaged land. The music is also very deliberately placed, coming and going to match the scene appropriately. Like when it kicks up a notch in the first level as Rayman starts to get his bearings and the mission truly begins. While Rayman 2 is an atmospheric game, it's also relentlessly committed to that one atmosphere. The boggy swamp, and oh look, the boggy swamp. B-Mask put it best in his Rayman video when he said the game starts to feel like one long level. Repetition eventually sets in, especially past the halfway mark. And this mono atmosphere seems like a deliberate choice, not something they were forced into, say, by the tech of the time. Enclosed and foggy or open and wide, the gloominess is always there. There's a moment where you're going down this slope towards what feels like the first truly sunny sky in the game, only for an immediate psych, back down into the damp caves with you. And then they throw in a big spider with ominous music. I don't know what it is about spiders, but the lower the poly count, the creepier they are. One of the title's strengths is this often meticulous direction. A lot of moments that only last a few seconds have a handcrafted touch that make them linger in the memory. This boss fight, starting by having the camera zoom in from the control room where the boss is being manipulated, is one such very stylish touch. While I enjoy picking up Rayman 2 again to soak up the mood, after a while that mood does become a bit suffocating, when the magical setting could have facilitated far more variety very naturally. The little side characters sit at the brighter end of the gloom spectrum, one note but rounding out the world and hinting at the status quo before the pirates arrived. Another bright spot is the platforming, which can be pretty fun. While Rayman moves a bit stiff, like I said, the targets of your jumps are pretty forgiving, the game ramping up in challenge well, as you have to mix in glides and grapples quickly, ratcheting all the way up to a later level that's just one big obstacle course chase. It's good to see even a game more focused on atmosphere and the overall experience still try and push its mechanics like that. Where things are pushed a little too far are the different weird things Rayman can ride. The game goes from forgiving to unforgivingly precise the second you hop on a missile or plum. The variables of 3D suddenly crashing down on the game, in the missile's case with the added debris of its fragility. A good chunk of the challenges involving this stuff is optional, so no big deal I guess, but it's certainly the more gimmicky sections of Rayman 2 that weigh it down the most. And it ends on one to mixed results. Razorbeard's most intimidating moment is early on, when he eats one of the collectibles, forever changing the home screen HUD. A weirdly piercing personal slight to the player themselves. Then at the end he shows up in a funny robot and you're tested on your flight skills. There's not much satisfaction to be gained at the end either, as Razorbeard gets away to no doubt appear in a bunch of Game Boy spin-offs and party games mandated by the Ubisoft emperors, though this is pretty funny. The game flatlines a bit towards the end, and any grander point it was hinting at early on gets lost as the scope narrows, the gaps between big milestones growing smaller and smaller before the finale shows up. Events like having to back up to an earlier level with new info to proceed turns out to be a one-off novelty and not a rhythm the game replicates again, which could have been cool. But when the game is flowing and the mood is hitting, Rayman 2 has a feel like no other, even if it is basically one feel. And I won't say there's no modulation within the scope of that feel. One memorable section to me was the water area. Like the sludge of the swamp has decomposed into pure liquid, so does the atmosphere melt away from moody to pure nothingness. Only picking up again for a deep-sea dive that contrasts well with the return to quiet after emerging. I will say the level select setup feels like it's working against the intended sense of place some of these levels are trying to convey. A lot of levels are intended to be underground or high above the sky, but it's hard to get a sense of that when you arrive through a portal and leave just the same. I have my doubts this would have been technically feasible, but arriving at these locations seamlessly would have helped convey their place in the overall world, as well as improved the sense of scale the journey is going for, and that it undermines by having you zap around. There was effort put into creating a defined world. Level selects make more sense when the stages are more non-Euclidean than this, I'd say. Either way, the team had struck on a unique world with what they put together in Rayman 2, one very different from the original, but perhaps something to build on moving forward, the punchline being that didn't happen at all. For better and only a little bit for worse, Rayman 3 proved to be another reset to the series. Not as drastic perhaps in pure technology, after all this is another 3D platformer, but you can tell an immediate shift has happened the moment you boot up the game, and the series reintroduces itself with a hip-hop rap number. It is cool though. A subtle change to Rayman's character design has also been made, his Boy Scout red neckerchief becoming a red hoodie. New power-ups give Rayman spiked gloves and chain whip grapples, hell yeah. Rayman now irreverently raises his eyebrow. The game is trying to slightly make him a little bit more rad by the standards of the time, and it has its appeal. Taken alongside the retconned uniqueness Rayman possesses now as the only limbless character around, This way he's been recast as this magical emissary, even by the standards of the already magical world he finds himself in, does give the character a unique, fresh flair. Like Rayman is a summoned chosen one, but distorted through the lens of what a 12-year-old thinks a cool hero should be like. Hoodied up with floppy hair and a bit of tood. Like when Shaquille O'Neal Genie came out of the boombox in Kazam. Anyway, this time around, Andre the Black Lum, a twisted, evil version of the Red Lum, the critters that restore Rayman's health, has multiplied. His duplicates in turn becoming the Hoodlums, an army of bumbling gangsters looking to cause havoc. A little less industrial than the pirates, and more patchwork. This is scuppered though when Glowbox, a dopey side character from Game 2, swallows this villain, and Rayman has to find a way to get the bad guy out of there while, keeping the host alive.
Shut it!
This sillier premise than 2 is combined with a shift towards much more contemporary humor and referencing.
Here, check out what I found. The manual. It's all in here. Hey, if I were you, I'd call it quits and head straight for the Spider-Man 2 auditions.
And a lot of that humor is hit or miss. But the overt new comedy angle is thankfully just one aspect of the game. Rayman 3's great strength is its diversity, goofy and silly at times, but at others still putting in the work to create a thick, wonderful atmosphere that itself can range from light and feathery to moody and mystical. The tone is lighter than 2's, but no less wondrous in its presentation, this time delivering on multiple moods and executing on them all pretty effectively, if for not as long each time. The Fairy Council is a great way to open the game, like you've been pulled suddenly from your bed in the middle of the night for an adventure, most of the world slumbering, unaware as you rush about the night trying to prevent catastrophe. The soundtrack evolving and growing louder as we tick down to disaster. This all gets goofily undercut by the center of the council being a funky disco room.
The heart. That's where all the world's energy comes from.
And the premise itself kicking in of Glowbox swallowing Andre.
Get me out of here or I'll start chewing!
A joke I do find funny. Rayman 3 strikes the same balance as Ratchet 1 for me, where the cynical comedy doesn't interrupt the levels from still evoking a thick mood. While here, the cheekiness doesn't mean there can't be a thick mood elsewhere either. It helps though when the game is genuinely funny. Andre being swallowed by Glowbox leads to a lot of good humor, and some one-off jokes are just funny all by themselves with great delivery.
Rayman, these disguises are getting a bit ridiculous. I mean, they're not even good.
That said, some of the comedy comes off kind of slapdash.
I need to go fire up the barbecue.
Relying merely on some out-of-place statement to be funny without an actual joke to go with it.
I have to go flush the toilet.
Wow, you wouldn't think someone would say this in a fantasy world. What if the Gelfling from Dark Crystal had to remember it was bin night? Yeah, alright.
I need to go make some waffles.
In a game trying much more overtly to be funny and through dialogue at that. It's a shame that for us English speakers, that it feels like the localization is undermining things. I have to assume that in the original French, some of this made more sense.
I have to go brush my goldfish.
I mean, you can tell something is off by the menu saying press X to validate and not enter or something. As a kid, I often didn't understand what characters in this game were getting at, and even at the time, just assumed they were jokes I just didn't get yet, which in some cases was true.
I was told that after Rayman 2, I'd be cast as a tormented artist who falls for a girl with great big eyes.
But in other cases, age and context has not helped. As a kid, I assumed I was too young to understand certain things here. Playing as an adult, I often feel like I'm having a stroke.
I had to go look over there to see if I'm there.
What is anyone going on about?
I have to go break something. Yeah, you'd rake in the dough and people would stop thinking you were my pet rabbit. I need to go mow my petunias.
And don't say I can't pick up a vibe just because I'm whacked out.
I need to go alphabetize my sausages.
Sometimes adult humor and complete nonsensical randomness combine to give you a double stroke.
I've been a bad boy. A very, very bad boy.
The contemporary humor has more in common with 1 than 2. Taking control of a boss's weapon to the screams of an unseen wrestling announcer would seem more at home in a game that contextualized checkpoints by having someone take your picture in a photo cutout. But if Rayman 1 was occasionally contemporary in its humor, it was still nonsensical otherwise, and Rayman 3 creates a mood all its own by combining the gags with a more grounded world like 2's. Another element that resets the feel of the game is the brand new combo point system, something which quite frankly might be the most unique and singular thing the Rayman series has introduced to the action platformer genre. In Rayman 3, the combo system doesn't just multiply points based on back-to-back kills, but also when you pick up collectibles back-to-back too. All of it tied together under one count, unifying the collecting and the clobbering under a single umbrella. Take down an enemy and you have about 6 seconds before the multiplier resets. Pick up a collectible and you'll get 2 seconds. You can use these times to multiply your points and achieve massive scores. It has you thinking about the levels in this new holistic way, where planning a route through both the enemy and the jewelry becomes rewarding. Have a power-up engaged while getting points and you'll times your